What matters most? Chasing social validation or forming social nets, particular kinds of social nets, like strong ones that fit with your interests, or participating in existing social nets that fit with your interests. So I begin with a similar question to what I raised in the first moment. What matters more? I give two alternatives. What matters more? A, what matters most to you? Or B, anything else? So what matters more? What matters most to you? Or anything else? Sometimes people are influenced to focus away from what matters most to them and instead to focus their attention on issues that have been selected by a particular special interest group. In moderation or on occasion, it might be beneficial to individuals for them to focus on a few extra issues that may give them a long-term advantage eventually. Maybe those new issues will matter soon, even if they do not seem to matter much yet. That is possible. So this idea that some special interest group could present someone an idea that could benefit them, that's quite possible. In fact, that's really the whole basis of me making this presentation to you. It's to benefit me as well as to benefit you. So in contrast to this, casual presentation, there are other cases where presentations are made that are required to be noticed, that are required to be participated in. I think in particular of schools, where there is a requirement for schooling. And so why is it that there would be a requirement for schooling? Well, perhaps a special interest group or a set of special interest groups plans some curriculum that to them it's very valuable to publicize to wide numbers of people, large numbers of people. So then they create the curriculum they want everyone to be exposed to, all the young people to be exposed to, and then they make it a crime to not participate within their programming system. So that's very unlike a casual presentation that I make to you here by a video. Conforming to the interests of a powerful group could have a variety of consequences, like a government, but could be many other groups that aren't governments that could be powerful. Conforming to the interests of a powerful group could have a variety of consequences. Conformity could be dangerous. It could even have people be less attentive to risks. Or conformity could be beneficial, or it could be a mixture of many things. It could be beneficial immediately. It could be beneficial in the long run. It could seem beneficial in the short run, but have long-term negative consequences. There's lots of possibilities. Various kinds of nonconformity, especially when openly practiced, can have different consequences. Those can also involve unique risks to display or practice nonconformity, and there can be unique opportunities in practicing nonconformity or even displaying nonconformity. And we can assess and explore some different alternatives soon. First, let's go back to that original question and that original issue of what matters most. When people organize their lives around what matters most to them, what results are predictable? We could observe that some people seem unusually clear, focused, maybe coherent or well-spoken, and committed to producing specific results through their own personal experimentation. So they're committed to results and they explore different methods for producing that result. They could be extremely interested in precisely measuring the results of whatever method that they select, or the different methods that they select. They want to measure which method is working and how well is it working. They're interested. If they do not produce the results that motivate them, then what happens? This is for somebody who's clear, focused, stable, calm. If they don't produce the results that motivate them, then they can openly express their disappointment. No big deal. And then shift right to exploring other methods that might be more effective. Or at a minimum, they divest from something that they've determined isn't working for them. They stop using it. So compared to what is familiar to us, those people who have their foundation clear and rooted deeply in what matters most to them, those people might be unusually uninterested in casting blame or justifying themselves. So we might be really used to people casting blame or justifying themselves, condemning a particular aspect of reality, ridiculing a particular group of people. So these people who are unusually clear and focused, they're not focusing on the outcome of other people in general agreeing with their stories or their ideas. They're focused on producing some kind of a tangible result, typically. They might be focused on specific people agreeing with their ideas, but that's different. They're not necessarily obsessed with consensus, with everyone agreeing with them or everyone in their midst agreeing with them. They have tolerance of different views. They even value contrasting views. That's unusual in some social contexts where consensus is highly valued and diversity of views and opinions is perhaps limited to two options, say Republican and Democrat. And if you're not one of those two, then if you're not towing one of those approved party lines, if you're not adhering to one of those two sets of idealism, then there might not be much social validation or social approval given for that. There might not be that much interest by the average person in contrasting ideas. They want to know what to oppose and what to promote. And that's basically it. What are their main enemies or opposition, and what's their main, allies. So some people aren't so focused on other people in general agreeing with their ideas or their stories. They will be consistently interested in other people in just two basic ways. Which people can most contribute to the selected goal? That's one way. And which people, if any, can most interfere with their production of satisfactory results? So they're actually focused on an outcome and producing it. So who can help them do it? And who could be a hindrance or a distraction or even interfere with producing that result? And it's not just about people, it's about what practices contribute and what practices could hinder or interfere or waste resources or distract. So everything is relative to that clear, you could say, beacon or landmark, that clear point of reference of that's my destination. Does something move me toward it? Does something move me away from it or go, sideways? What's a good path to get there? There are lots of paths to get there. What's the best one? Is the one that I'm on now going well? Should I look with great interest for other paths? And people who are attentive to where they're going also might, on occasion, select maybe an intermediate destination or even change destinations altogether. So that was all in reference to people who are clear about what matters most to them and are focusing on what matters most to them and then organizing their lives around what matters to them. In contrast, there are other people, and I'm setting this up as two, kind of isolated groups. I will later talk about how that's an oversimplification. But for simplicity, in contrast, have you ever noticed an instance of people or a person who seems to be competing with other people for social validation? Maybe two people that are competing for social validation. Maybe there's like a group, and then those two people are fighting or arguing while they have an audience. And they seem to really like the audience, the fact that they have an audience. So they kind of work together to create a scene or to create a theater. We use the term scene in a theatrical production. So they've created a little theater or a little scene for the group to be attentive to the two of them, and then they compete with each other for social validation. Maybe they argue intensely over an issue that has no long-term personal relevance to any of them, like some kind of political issue that is about 20 years ago or 20 years from now, or for whatever reason just isn't that directly relevant to them. After they have their big public debate or argument or theater, a month or a year passes and they don't seem to be so interested in that issue anymore. Why? Because they maybe never were interested in the issue. They just liked the spotlight. They liked the social validation, the approval. They were competing for social approval. So maybe they argue, maybe they display hysterical outrage that there are other perceptions or perspectives besides their own. Instead of valuing diversity and variety, they may have hysterical outrage about diversity and variety. They are like infants throwing a tantrum, screaming something like, "I totally lack respect for the obvious reality that there are a variety of points of view." So that's not even really that funny in a way when I make the reference like that, because a lot of us have had some personal experience with these kinds of patterns of behavior. What would I label that kind of experience as? I would say it's distress. When somebody is in a tantrum or, competing for social approval, that's maybe stressful or even distress. So how is it that such distress could develop? It isn't always distress when people are competing. If they're competing for social dominance, that's not the same as competing for social approval or social validation. So how is it that people could develop distress over the issue of how much social validation they are attracting, such that people, 4 people might compete or 2 people might compete to attempt to attract as much social validation as possible? Well, if they're attempting to organize their lives around some issue or issues other than their own core interests and core motivations, what would be the predictable results? That way of operating can lead to internal conflict, compromise. They have to set aside their real interests or even deny their real interests, distract themselves from their real interests. That's going to lead to inefficiency, disorder, chaos, maybe even sudden irregularities, like, things seem to be going smooth, but then there's, strange sudden breakdowns occasionally, not just once, but, occasionally. I used terms like self-sabotage, so always or frequently using some point of reference other than one's own real core interests and motivation, that can lead to self-sabotage, exhaustion, frustration, certainly disappointment, but also despair. And despair is an intense form of grief. They are despairing or desperate. They are really disappointed. They could be cynical, like, this is never going to work. There's no way for me to ever change my lack of clarity about what motivates me or my lack of fulfillment of my interests. Those are cynical comments that we might hear or we might say. Now, in many cases, when someone is despairing like that, then asking for help would be the expected or predictable behavior. Like, in normal circumstances, that would be functional. That would be obvious even. What do we expect for someone who is desperate or despairing? ask for help. However, when there's also shame about the grief or desperation, then that can produce an intense distress and a lack of directly asking for help. Instead of just carrying a sign down to the intersection of the road and saying, I need help with, whatever, or I need help, or instead of directly asking for help in some other way, there could be just a background of distress and agonizing and ineffective approaches to attracting help. So what's left for them to do if there is an intense repulsion to asking for help directly, but also intense desperation? They could invent an excuse for other people to offer to help them. They may even construct an excuse for them to ask for help, but in a specific, limited way, without directly admitting to their desperation and distress. They may not even know that they're in distress. I mean, they may know on some level, but they don't call it distress. They might call it stress. So they may practice negligent or risky behavior in order to create personal breakdowns. Breakdowns could be medical breakdowns, financial breakdowns, social breakdowns. Those things can happen even during the best of intentions. But in some cases, there's clear patterns of behavior that anybody looking at it would say, you knew not to do that, or you knew that instead you should do this other thing that you kept not doing, like not filling your gas tank of your car. Well, if you drive a lot and refuse to fill your gas tank, there's a predictable outcome, right? So after creating personal breakdowns, maybe semi-intentionally or semi-consciously, then the people then have an excuse to ask for help. They publicize that they've got this problem. Maybe they publicize that they've been victimized by whoever they vilify, whoever they were hoping that a particular government was going to be more or less of a certain way. So they may have these backgrounds of resentment and vilification, and that might be part of how they interact with each other or would interact with other people. So they're going to present complaints about whatever groups. And as they present these complaints, one of the things they might be interested in is how interested are other people in their own well-being, their own process, their own experience, their own results, their own practices, their own motivations, their own interests. So when I talk about throwing a tantrum about, what was it that I said? Throwing a tantrum about, the fact that there are other points of view besides their own. Gosh, that's when people throw tantrums like that, outrage about other points of view existing. How can those people even think differently than I think? When they're that kind of tantrum, or when there's a psychological drama of the sort where people are creating breakdowns repeatedly. Does any of that sound familiar? If it does, how familiar does it sound to you? Maybe you've even practiced some of those things yourself, some of those patterns of behavior. Are you also aware of instances when you experimented with those kinds of social signals to attract other people to offer you help of some kind? I certainly can point to specific things. I mean, like the most obvious thing that comes to mind for me is a pretty severe medical breakdown. I don't know that I'd say I intentionally constructed it, but an element of negligence was a factor. It wasn't like an injury, like car wreck or something that driving drunk or something that obvious, but we're dealing with a spectrum of things. So people create contexts, unconsciously or consciously, where they need to ask for help, or where they eventually ask for help. How directly do they do it? If they only ask for help indirectly, and they have all sorts of disorderly commentary when they do ask for help, then that's a signal of a background of confusion. Maybe they're not really related powerfully to their own interests, to their own motivations. So perhaps you've said to someone something like this: "Oh no, I really did not want to ask, but if you're offering, yes. As long as it's not a burden to you." So there's this issue of disappointing others or burdening others with whatever it may be. Instead of, "Here's what I want, here's what I'd like, can you help me with that? Are you willing to help me with that?" There's like this weirdness around, is it not too much to ask, and so on. So I'm generalizing here, of course, but I'm going to call that way of relating subservience, or it's deferring, right? Or a victim mentality. Somebody is like the damsel in distress is kind of a classic phrase. There's a damsel in distress. Someone can go, "Oh, a damsel in distress. I will heroically rescue the damsel now." So with that pattern of subservience or a victim mentality, there can be a background of social anxiety about what's really going on for somebody. They only want to impose on other people in an extreme thing. They don't want to stress other people or bring up minor issues. If something matters to me, it's good for me to know and then to communicate that when I see it as appropriate. I don't have to be, I can be kind of cautious and modest and discreet as far as how I present it and to whom I present it and so on. But the general fact of an interest of mine, it's good for me to know what my interests are, what my priorities are, what my motivations are. So there can be a background of social anxiety and shame in regard to any form of asking for help or any form of inviting partnership and collaboration. So instead of directly admitting to their self-interest or just declining to discuss their self-interest, why they're asking, they may invest significant amounts of energy into justifying their patterns of behavior. "No, it's not that, it's this." And it's not just a casual, "No, it's not that, it's this." It can be very dramatic. It can be very theatrical, even like a tantrum. "No, it's not like that. I already told you." How many times I have to tell you in this, weird frustration and distress, panic even. So they're anxious or in distress about how other people in general will relate to them and to their patterns of action. So I'm going to break here in a couple paragraphs. So I'll stop this one and start a second video. So let's first summarize what we've covered so far. We've just reviewed two basic contrasting patterns of how people can relate to what matters most to them. They can respect what matters most, or they can neglect what matters most to them. And typically they would do that to focus instead on competing for social validation of any kind. Any attention that I can get from others, whether I use negative behaviors or positive behaviors, people are competing for attention rather than learning how to best produce the results that are attractive to them. And of course, sometimes there's a degree of overlap. There's a spectrum between the two extremes, and I'll mention that more in a moment. So attracting a specific form of social validation might occasionally be the most important outcome to someone. They want a specific form of social validation. That does certainly happen. However, for people, the contrast would be any kind of attention, any kind of social validation. They're just wanting the spotlight to be on them. And for people who've been programmed by special interest groups to neglect their self-interest, well, let me back up because I've kind of jumped over, I've tangled up what I was saying. I'll untangle it and simplify. Some people may have been programmed by special interest groups to neglect their self-interest and agonize over constant social validation. And we can later discuss how that pattern of behavior could be so common in some cultures and completely absent in others. So some people may have been programmed by special interest groups to neglect their self-interest and agonize over constant social validation. We could call that social anxiety in general. but how much frustration would we expect for those people to be experiencing? Like if they're neglecting their self-interest and agonizing over constant social validation, how frustrating would that be? Wouldn't that be intensely frustrating for them? They would experience being trapped or stuck. And you could imagine that it makes sense for them to vilify a particular victim, to vilify a particular, enemy group or whatever it may be, the threatening outcome, the apocalyptic problem. These are valid ways of attracting attention. It works or doesn't work in any particular case, but it's certainly, it's to use drama and theatrics can work. So if someone's been programmed by special interest groups to neglect their self-interest and agonize over constant social validation, how much distress would we expect for them to be experiencing ongoingly and at any particular moment in time? How much shame? How much social anxiety? How much satisfaction, on the other hand? How much fulfillment? How much gratitude? How much cheerfulness? If they display cheerfulness and gratitude, are they doing it because they are intimidated into doing it? They're terrified and paranoid and, doing it as a theater to get approval. They're not authentically expressing gratitude, perhaps in some cases, or in other cases they might be. But it could be mixed. They could be insincerely displaying gratitude or displaying cheerfulness because that's what's going to get them the job or keep them the job or get them the good grade or whatever, target they may be focusing on. And for them to have all of those theatrical methods is sometimes effective and appropriate, and sometimes ineffective, or what I would call inappropriate. Why would I say it's inappropriate? Well, because it might be ineffective for them. It might be not producing the rewards they want. It might be attracting punishments or friction, social friction that they don't want. So finally, realistically, as I said before, there is a broad spectrum between these two extremes. The two extremes of intensely focusing one's own attention on one's self-interest, like self-discovery, and intense concentration on competing with others for social validation. So which extreme would we call inner peace? And which would we call distressed hysteria? Which would we call being self-aware? And which would we call being self-conscious? So these have just been some introductory comments. In the next section, I talk about social nets and the importance of social nets, what I mean by that and why they're important, and the variety of different kinds of social nets that we may find ourselves in or that we may construct intentionally in order to fulfill on what matters most to us, individually or even within a group.